In this final lecture of week 9, we're going to take a look at some of the implications flowing out of the Diothelite definition coming out of Lateran 649 as well as Constantinople 3 as they pertain and are applied through development of a consistent use of theological language and distinctions to the essence energies discussion by the later theologian and Saint Gregory Palamas, and we'll also look at this as an ulterior development of divine distinctions ad intra that flow directly out of Constantinople 3 and the Lateran 649, following the Dyothelitic genius of Saint Maximus the Confessor, as this ramifies into a full-blown doctrine of God ad intra, with respect to the distinction of the essence or super essence of God in himself and the energies, the uncreated energies through which he operates and manifests himself ad extra. And then we'll have opportunity, or take opportunity rather, to compare these developments in Pauline theology with parallel developments. And then, although this won't be the topic of this lecture, I point out the fact that while there are parallel developments on these issues between the Pauline school, St. Gregory Palamas and his disciples, and the Franciscan school, St. Bonaventure Duns Scotus and their followers, East and West, respectively, will find reconvergence in certain ways in the Pauline theologian and scholar and Archbishop of Constantinople, Gennadius Scholarius, who lived and wrote during the time of the Council of Florence through the fall of Constantinople in 1453, excuse me, and was a major Pauline theologian that integrated aspects of Franciscan theology in order to give better conceptual and metaphysical transparency, clarity, and rigor to his dogmatically accepted Pauline theology of the distinction of essence and energies ad intra. So, getting back to the basics of this, out of the Diothelite controversy and the teaching of Constantinople 3, that in Christ there are two natures, two wills, and thus two energies at the very least, two questions arise. Obviously, granting that the councils teach that Jesus Christ equals one person of and in two natures, who in possessing these natures possesses them completely and perfectly, and if there is such a perfect possession of two perfect natures, then that will entail a perfect possession of the natural properties proper to both natures, and thus if there is a perfection of natural properties, there will be two natural wills, one divine and one human, and if there are two natural wills, then there will be at least two natural energies in Christ, the divine energy and the human energy, which manifest the divine will and the created will respectively. Obviously, through this doctrine of Dyothelitism and the affirmation of multiple energies, at least two, there's no clear block or obstacle to discerning further or additional distinct energies in either the human composite or substance, as well as in the infinite and uncompounded divine essence. That's not a topic that is taken on directly in Lateran 649 or Constantinople 3, but nevertheless it lays the foundations and establishes a metaphysical commitment to a distinction between natures and their properties and energies, and a further distinction between the energies themselves. Well, if this is the case, that there is a distinction between energies on the one hand, and then a distinction between energies and powers or properties and natures on the other hand, well then how do we begin to speak of this distinction? A common patristic way to distinguish how the divine and human qua natures in the hypostatic union are distinguished. And we will list some of the main figures who articulated this distinction is so-called according to reason, or the distinction is recognizable in reason alone. And this is then applied to the energies themselves with respect to the distinction between nature and energy, as well as energy and energy. The second question flows out and is rather presupposed by the first question, is that granted there is this distinction between energies and nature on the one hand, or essence on the one hand, and energies on the other, how is this distinction to be understood, and how is it to be maintained? What are the epistemological and metaphysical bases for this kind of distinction? And then how then can it be applied? Is it unique to the divinity, unique to the humanity, unique to the hypostatic union? And we will find that this kind of distinction is metaphysically common across the uncreate, create disjunct, and is applicable in different manners to God ad intra, as well as to various created entities. The focus here will be, though, the application of the distinction between essence and energies, and then energy and energy to God ad intra. And again, this distinction flows out of the metaphysical commitments coming out of Constantinople III. Rehearsing where we've come from thus far, and the current point of arrival with respect to the distinction between natures and energies, and then the distinction between natures and energies. First, we have Chalcedon 451 in the Tome of Leo, and you can see the Denzinger numbers there. Basically, at issue is two natures in one Christ, and those two natures operate according to or in and through their proper forms and activities. Lateran 649, Denzinger number 511, teaches that in Christ there are two natures and two undivided energies, the divine and human. And again, that teaching is repeated in Constantinople III, 681. So here, the speculation on the distinction between essence and energy, or nature and energy, and then the distinction between energies themselves flows right out of the Christological development of Dyothelitism and Dioenergism, rooted in the councils of Chalcedon, Lateran 649, and Constantinople III. Again, remember that Pope Leo, in terms of the two natures, and St. Maximus the Confessor, in terms of the two wills and two energies, are quite important. And so this is the ecumenical dogmatic root of the speculation and the further clarification that the concept of the distinction in God, in theology proper, between essence and energies, and then between the energies themselves, this is the dogmatic basis that will get taken up again in the 13th and 14th centuries in the West and in the East, respectively. So now with the first distinction, remember that the council fathers throughout several councils taught that the distinction between the humanity and the divinity, and thus the energies, are distinguishable only according to reason. This doctrine is common to the fathers and has several applications that we will review, and then settle upon the one taken up and developed by St. Gregory Palamas. In terms of the distinction according to reason, this is first found in Methodius of Olympus, who died in 311 AD, and then is repeated and developed along or according to oftentimes basic Stoic categories, which, if you remember back to our lecture on Sergius, the grammarian, the Monophysite theologian criticized by Severus of Antioch, this Stoic approach to the notion of union is in essence crassly materialist. So, and then is predicated upon a kind of division of parts into parts through out of a mixture. So oftentimes the Stoic designation is reducible to a kind of materialist account, which is obviously rejected by the fathers, but nevertheless, the terminology and the use of language tends to correspond to the Stoic account of distinction here. And then we will see St. Gregory Palamas taking his own tact from the basis of St. Methodius of Olympus to develop his own distinction between essence and energies with respect to God ad intra. So the fathers who mention this, some of the main fathers who mention this in both their own writings, but also in terms of official inter-ecclesial writings, include the already mentioned Methodius. Also, we find St. Basil the Great using this terminology, St. Gregory Nazianzen, Cyril of Alexandria, Sophronius of Jerusalem, Maximus himself, Pope Agatho in his letter to the emperor before the Council of Constantinople III. Constantinople III also affirms this notion, and the Damascene picks up this language about the nature of the distinction. The distinction between the essence and energies is only according to reason, as an application and extension of the distinction between the two natures in the one Christ. But the foundation of that reason, or of that distinction, and the nature of that distinction is yet to be developed. In some sense, it becomes almost a truism that's repeated by the fathers without much conceptual or metaphysical clarity or development. And this is something that St. Gregory provides. And we'll find St. Gregory departing from certain materialist understandings of this distinction and going for his own distinction, one found first in, again, St. Methodius of Olympus, all the way back in the early 4th century. But first, let's go back to the question at issue, the distinction between essence and energies. St. Gregory Palamas, in his famous Triads, takes up this problem in the context of a controversy he was carrying out with Barlaam, who denied the essence-energies distinction. For Barlaam, only the divine essence was uncreate, and therefore was unknowable through concept or word, and imparticiple because finite or infinite. That is, the divine essence is unknowable and imparticiple as such because infinite. And for Barlaam, then, he made the inference, because the energies couldn't be identical to the unknowable, increate or uncreate infinite essence of God, that all other energies were simply created. And thus he explodes any notion of real participation. Implicitly, he undermines the very notion of creation, and he undermines the epistemic access to talking about God and naming God, because he reduces all the energies to simply created entities without any uncreated component. So then the question that Palamas has to answer is, it's clear that Scripture speaks of the energies of God as in some way distinct from the essence of God as such, and thus the essence of God is super essential with respect to any of his energies. Nevertheless, the energies themselves are uncreate, and God is fully in each energy, wholly and completely. So how in the world are we to maintain these two truths, the super essential infinity of God and the truly divine, eternal, uncreated energies of God, by which or through which God creates, and by which and through which created persons especially are able to know God, name God through these energies as manifestations of God himself, and thus participate and enter into the process of theosis, or recreation in Christ, becoming totally conformed to Christ through the energies. So Palamas will take up the Dionysian distinction between God's essence in itself as super-essential, thus absolutely and intensively infinite, meaning that God's essence as such is not able to be formalized through a concept, nor because it's not able to be abstracted from any particular created substance, any created accident, or any created reality, because every created reality is circumscribed, and every essence, even if uncreated, is formally limited, and thus is not coextensive with the intensive or maximal infinity of God, whereby God infinitely transcends his energies and also infinitely transcends any created entity, even created thought about God, on the basis of abstraction from God's self-manifestation through his energies in creation. So in the first place, then, he uses the distinction between the super essence of God as intrinsically and intensively or maximally infinite, and because of that infinity, is not able to be comprehended or spoken, so to speak, through a mental concept or word or a external verbal expression or term that coextends or captures the infinite essence of God himself. Thus, God's essence in itself, or God in himself in his essence, infinitely transcends even his energies, even though his energies are increate, and even though the energies themselves, as uncreated, are the means by which he manifests his essence, and through which he creates and recreates, and by which created persons enter into communion with God and conformity to God in terms of the process of purification and illumination in faith, the process of theosis, or spiritual growth. So the first aspect here is the affirmation of the distinction between God's essence in itself as superessence or essence beyond essence, and here is a Dionysian distinction that is taken up by Maximus the Confessor and then taken over by St. Gregory himself, in securing the radical transcendence and uniqueness of God in himself, and ultimately the inaccessibility qua infinite of God to anything that is not God, anything that is finite or created. Another aspect of St. Gregory Palamas's articulation of how this works is this notion between the disjuncts, the commonly called in Latin terminology the disjunctive transcendentals. The transcendentals being those which transcend any of the finite Aristotelian categories, but as disjunctive, they can be, although not limited or included or coterminous with any finite category of Aristotle. Nevertheless, these notions extend to each of the categories, but in themselves, such as unity, truth, goodness, or any personal perfections having to do with intellect, will, wisdom, and the like, they are able to be instantiated in their proper and perfect mode in an infinite manner. Thus, you have the disjunction between within these transcendentals, within these perfections, by which we participate in God and through which God manifests himself. We have the disjunction between infinite, finite, create, uncreate, and create, independent, dependent, necessary, contingent, and the like. So what this allows then is for a way to navigate conceptually and linguistically and logically between the finite instantiations and the finite objects of knowledge, even though they are terms of God's uncreated energies ad extra with respect to creation and recreation. Nevertheless, these energies remain uncreate while they are known by a created mind, and thus provide access both noetically or epistemically and metaphysically by means of participation in the divinity without thereby collapsing the distinction between God's intrinsically, maximally infinite essence, which is beyond all being and knowing, and the finite limitations of created beings and created concepts and knowledge. Going on with Palamas, we find then that God has not only an unoriginated essence, but also unoriginated powers and energies or works. But these three terms are roughly interchangeable for Palamas, and in translation, they do the same work as the more common term of energies or activities. Palamas himself writes, these works, or equals qua energies, which equal energies of God, are manifestly unoriginated and pre-temporal. His foreknowledge, will, providence, contemplation of himself, and whatever a power are akin to these are in themselves unoriginated energies, thus eternal divine energies, uncreated energies of God that flow from his infinite essence. An example that Palamas gives is obviously his providence. God must have an uncreated providence prior to creation in order to carry out the function or preserve the very meaning of providence. Another important point in Palamas that we've already mentioned is the fact that Palamas takes up from Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzen, and St. John Damascene, as well as St. Maximus, a positive notion of infinity, which refers essentially to an understanding that affirms a maximal greatness, a maximal perfection to God in his essence, and thus sets this off from a pagan notion which looks at an infinity as essentially a negative aspect of an imperfect being, meaning the negation or the privation of an end for the pagans meant simply that a being was imperfect, whereas the negation for the fathers is stated negatively in order to affirm the positive aspect of maximally perfect, maximally great. And thus this is a key departure from pagan philosophical notions of infinity found both in Platonism, Neoplatonism, as well as Aristotelianism. And this is a key move, a key shift in the Christian understanding of God with respect to distinguishing God from creation as maximally infinite or maximally perfect in his being and essence, lacking no perfection, and exceeding and transcending any kind of finite conceptualization or verbal construct. And so St. Gregory Palamas, following this line of thought, is able to understand that in any beginning, in any being with a beginning, namely a created being, there must be, for that created being to exist in the manner that he exists, a pre-existence of uncreated virtues. And that is, again, energies and works, whereby the beginning, the being with the beginning, participates in various ways and in various degrees the uncreated reality of the eternal energies that are manifested in and through and to finite beings. And these pre-existent eternal virtues or energies are essential to God, and thus are God himself, but not to be understood as coterminous as energies with God in terms of his infinite essence. And thus we can participate in these virtues because there is an eternal originator, namely God, who acts ad extra and freely and contingently with respect to temporal terms, either in creation, all the created kinds based upon the eternal logoi of Maximus and Dionysius, whom St. Gregory of Palamas follows directly and completely on this point, through which and by which God is able to both know all possible instantiations of his power, and then through which he's able to bring into reality in time, in a contingent and free way, actual temporal beings, created beings, that then manifest and participate in these uncreated virtues in various, again, modes and degrees of perfection. However, what we have to understand is even if there are these uncreated virtues according to, or energies according to St. Gregory, God in himself transcends these virtues, created and uncreate, or these energies created and uncreate in his essence, in two basic ways. In the first way, God transcends created virtues because he is infinite and he's eternal cause. And he also, in his essence, his infinite essence, transcends the uncreated virtues themselves because in his essence, he is understood to be formally or superessentially infinite in a maximal manner which no individual energy considered as such, or in isolation, or even in a manner taken altogether in some sort of quasi-mathematical summation. None of these energies equal the infinite and super-essential essence of God in itself, and thus we have the distinction within God, the infinite essence, which is imparticiple and unknowable. Nevertheless, we have with the essence and essential to the divinity as such, these uncreated energies through which God manifests and by which he creates ad extra, which nevertheless bring God present in and through these energies in a perfect and simple way without implying any composition or imperfection. What St. Gregory is essentially doing is affirming the reality of the maximal infinity of God in himself, but nevertheless, God is able to know finite entities, whether uncreate or create, and he's able to create finite entities through these pre-existent eternal ideas or eternal virtues or eternal energies. And here Maximus himself looks at each of these notions, such as ideas or logoi, works, activities, virtues, energies, as essentially the same kind of thing. And he doesn't make much distinction. All of these different aspects can be just viewed as uncreated energies of God that are divine in themselves, and God is fully present in each of these uncreated energies, yet none of these uncreated energies taken alone or even altogether co-extend the super-essential essence of God in itself. So thus, what Maximus again is trying to do is open up a way for an understanding that preserves the radical transcendence of God in himself, and thus preserves the creator-creature distinction in the most perfect and complete way, while allowing for the reality of God to manifest himself in creation, both in created entities as well as in uncreated energies and virtues that can be known through the eyes of faith and through the process of spiritual perfection, and thus entail, or at least make possible, rather, a created participation, either in consideration of some created thing or substance, like a cat with all its essential properties and accidents and perfections, as manifestation and participation in God's being in a limited way, God's being as unity, truth, and goodness, manifesting itself in the particular cat that exists as finite, but also the very notion of cat, the very essence of cat also being a manifestation and a participation in God's uncreated energy and knowledge of catness from all eternity, that by which God knows and creates and engages in his providential ordering of both creation and recreation. And here, St. Gregory is following St. Maximus the Confessor and his articulation of the distinction between the infinite Logos of God, who is the termination of the Father's begetting, who possesses whole and entire the infinite and unknowable essence of God as such, and the Logoi that are manifested along with, in a secondary manner, the generation of the Logos, where the Logos, in a sense, by virtue of its own infinity, also includes an infinite number of ideas and energies from all eternity. So this is manifesting eternally, that then can, through the free act of God in terms of creation, can then be instantiated temporally, yet nevertheless maintain this relationship to the uncreated logoi, or the uncreated energy, this relationship of manifestation of God through creation and participation by creation in these uncreated energies. And here, St. Gregory importantly takes as axiomatic that notion that every essence or nature manifests through energies. So thus, in any manner nor any way that the divine essence manifests itself or operates energetically, that manifestation then of that nature must be through energies. And thus, in terms of every distinct manifestation, there will be a distinct energy. And here it's important then to understand that St. Gregory, following Maximus on this point, is simply stating that for a nature to really exist and manifest itself, it will exist and manifest through energies. And because God is eternal in his essence, his energies also will be eternal as manifesting. And thus, insofar as God manifests in creation, he will manifest through various energies. And there are some basic energies that God manifests through, namely the notions of the transcendentals, unity, truth, goodness, the very notion of being, but also in specific and important ways through personal perfections, namely intellect, will, wisdom, love, the reality of justice. These are also uncreated energies of God through which God manifests himself, and in which, in terms of their own being or reality, there is an eternal manifestation as energies, uncreated eternal energies of the superessential, intensively infinite divine being. So when we act through our created powers, we participate in energies that are uncreated and being manifested through the power of God, that stem from energies that are in themselves uncreated. So we manifest uncreated energies through created energies, and also uncreated energies themselves can be manifested through the spiritual life, through the process of theosis. Palamas then goes on to clarify that God is fully in every energy. Thus, every energy really is God, but every energy isn't coextensive with the reality that God is in his essence as absolutely and formally infinite. Every essence, we might say then, every energy, we might say then, affirms that God is in every energy. Nevertheless, the energies themselves, in terms of their content or quiddity, are finite with respect to two facts. One, they are able to be abstracted and known, or infused through the divine light in a finite mind. Thus, a finite mind is able to recognize and speak of uncreated energies. Yet God is fully in every energy. So thus there's a real identity between the divine essence and every uncreated energy, even if there is also a just as real, but in a different modality, distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies. And on the other hand, we find then that these energies, these uncreated energies themselves, although not formally infinite, because they again can be captured by the divine, by a created mind in some way, through abstraction and through participation. Nevertheless, because God is fully in every energy, and these energies themselves are uncreated, and God himself isn't composed of distinct parts and is inseparable from his energies in terms of his essence, then we can say then that the energies themselves, though formally finite in terms of their conceptualization, in terms of their identity and distinctness as energies, nevertheless are modally infinite in terms of their identity with the formally and modally infinite essence of God. So what we have here then is an introduction of a distinction between God's essence in itself, or considered in itself as absolutely unknowable and imparticiple, is formally and intensively infinite. And thus, because of its formal and intensive infinity, namely that the essence as such can just be designated as infinite, and infinite understood in the sense as maximally perfect, something only God knows, thus the essence itself transcends any particular energy. However, because of this ontological identity or metaphysical identity between the uncreated energies and the formal, infinite essence of God, the unknowable, ineffable, and imparticiple essence of God, nevertheless, these distinct uncreated energies, in their distinction and in their limitation, and thus in their knowability and participability in the created order, we can say then they are not formally infinite as such. Nevertheless, because of their real ontological identity with and in God himself, and with and in God's infinite, formally infinite essence, these energies as distinct take on modal infinity by dint of their maximal realization and perfection in the one infinite God. So we have a twofold distinction here then. We have the formal, intensive, maximal infinity of God in his essence, and then we have the modal infinity in terms of their being in themselves, in terms of their being divine of every energy. Nevertheless, their formal identity is limited in some way because, again, they're able to be manifested, participated in, and known by finite minds. So with this distinction in mind, then, Palamas is able to say that God is fully in every energy, in every one of his uncreated energies. And in fact, this is how we name him. We affirm that he is not composed, yet there's some real, meaning objective, non-identity between essence and energy, and between energy and energy. And going on, as St. Gregory clarifies, that individually and severally, the energies do not exhaust or manifest the essence as such, that is, the superessence of God, qua formal or intensive maximal infinity. Nevertheless, in terms of their real identity, in the simple, non-composed deity, God himself, these uncreated energies have a certain modal infinity that preserves their divinity and uncreatedness, while at the same time allowing for their distinction both from the essence as such and the every other energy as such, because there's a sufficient unity and intelligibility of the energies. Whereas, on the other hand, the super essence qua infinite of God is simply transcends all conceptualization by any being other than God himself. It would take a formally or intensively infinite being to comprehend the formally infinite being of God in his essence. Thus, if God is going to manifest himself, there must be some real objective distinction between his essence as infinite in itself and his uncreated energies through which and by which he creates and manifests ad extra. Nevertheless, these uncreated energies are also infinite in mode by dint of their metaphysical unity and identity with God himself. Again, God is not a composite being admitting of parts that are able to be parceled out or separated from one another or from the divine essence as such. God is absolutely perfect, and as absolutely perfect is absolutely stable in his being, both essence and energies. The distinction here is one of affirming and articulating a possibility of a metaphysics of creation, as well as recreation through theosis or deification, and in articulation of how we can speak of God in terms of naming him without falling into the error of thinking that through an individual name of God as, say, creator, or wise, more important, or just, or as person, or personal, that we're somehow capturing and circumscribing conceptually through a finite concept abstracted from finite creatures, the infinite and infinitely transcendent or transcending essence of God, which is inaccessible. Again, for St. Gregory, God dwells in inaccessible light, and he can be seen and known by no man. Nevertheless, God himself is in each one of his uncreated energies, and it's by these energies that we know and name and participate in God in a real and not merely metaphorical manner. And Palamas then bolsters his account by affirming the notion of theosis. Through the reality of deifying grace, we find that there is a distinction between the existence of various energies, either created and or uncreated, and their mode of existence. For example, the created energy of human understanding, formally speaking, refers to an energy that entails an act of conceptualization and an activation of an inner word or concept, the arrival at knowledge. So the existence then predicates some sort of rational being, qua knower, qua understander. However, the mode is something in addition to existence that further specifies and or clarifies the nature of the existence of the given energy. For a human person, the existence of understanding, the existence of finite rationality entails that the mode is finite. However, through the reality and the participation in deifying grace, we come to a recognition and a participation not only of finite existence, but infinite existence. But the existence that's manifested through the energy as such, as uncreated, is sufficiently cognizable and sufficiently distinct from other uncreated energies so that it allows us to understand what we're talking about. So if we participate in grace, and we might call that grace the love of God, we're understanding the existence of love. And when we understand the existence of this love in terms of the context of Christian faith and theosis, then we understand that this existence is uncreated. And so then we predicate uncreated of the love that we're experiencing in and through this deifying grace, or the love that we're at least considering in and through this deifying grace. And when we predicate uncreated of this existent love, then we specify that the mode is infinite. So thus the energy, considered qua energy, is able to be understood by a finite mind and also participated by a finite rational agent. However, the mode itself, as distinct, designates that the existent or the existing love is divine and thus eternal and uncreated. And here we find then an application of the distinction between create or uncreate in terms of a disjunct with respect to the existent of love. And through the application of the uncreate create disjunct, or better, the infinite finite disjunct, we find then that when we predicate uncreate, we're predicating a distinct mode, that is, a divine mode. And when we predicate create, we're predicating a distinct mode, a limited finite mode. And so thus we have to distinguish here through an application of the manifestation and participation in uncreated energies, the fact that these uncreated energies can be understood in themselves in terms of their existent knowability as items of finite knowledge. Nevertheless, their perfection is understood in terms of their mode, created or uncreated. And thus we find then that the uncreated energies, unlike the divine essence as such, which is formally and intrinsically infinitely transcending all creation and all even uncreated energies, the uncreated energies themselves are able to be participated. And when we recognize that the energies are uncreated, then we specify that these uncreated energies are modally infinite, even if formally able to be cognized and participated by a finite mind. And this goes again both ways. In order for God, according to St. Gregory, to create and manifest and deify, there must be this distinction simply because God's essence is radically and formally and transcendently infinite and thus imparticipable and unknowable. Thus, since he has created, there must be this kind of distinction between his essence and his energies, and it's by means of the uncreated energies, which are God in their reality, he is able to create and manifest. And in terms of creation, creation itself is able to manifest and participate and ultimately undergo theosis through and in and by means of these uncreated energies. So, on the basis of the fact of theosis, Palamas can then reasonably assert that essence and energies in God must both be uncreate, yet in some way distinct. Otherwise, there would be no possibility for manifestation, or we'd literally become God through participation, or every energy is created and we thus have no participation or knowledge of God. And thus there is really truly no creation and no recreation. And then we're back into pagan conceptions of the eternality of both the forms and the material aspects of the world that we experience, and either no God or a God that's collapsed into the immanent, namely there's no transcendent God, or we have a God so transcendent that he cannot be known and thus cannot be participated or in or imitated by a creature, and thus there could be no interpersonal relationship between a rational creature and God, and there can be no creaturely conformity to God in terms of some sort of specific qualitative likeness or similitude. Finally, and here's where Palamas brings us back to our point of departure, he says, if the immediately preceding, if there is no distinction between essence and energies as divine and uncreated, there would be no way to distinguish between the two natures and wills and energies in Christ. Here, he's making explicit the impetus of the nature of the discussion in the first place. Because if there were no essence energies distinction, then in terms of Christ's double nature, double properties, double energies, dogmatic understanding that comes out of Lateran 649 and Constantinople 3, if there were no distinction between essence and energy, then there would simply be no way for God to manifest his divine energy in and through the one Christ, because there'd simply be no way to create as distinct from simply moving into some sort of relationship of identity with respect to God and creation. So in Christ, we'd either have a being totally divine or a being in no way divine. Thus, there would be only a divine nature, and in that case, we would collapse into a kind of pantheistic understanding and a necessitarian kind of cosmology in which there is no creation. There's only emanation that is necessary, or we would simply have a human Christ and no divinity, because obviously the essence itself is not able to manifest because it's infinite, and thus in order for it to manifest, it must manifest through distinct energies that are able to be signified and effected in a way that is perceptible by a finite mind. If it were the case that there, according to St. Gregory, that there were no distinction between essence and energies, then Christ himself would have no idea of his divinity, because Christ in his humanity, that's what I mean, in his humanity, his human nature, because it's finite, there would also be a finite rational power, and thus there would be no manifestation even to Christ's perfect human rational powers, a distinction between his created energy, his human energy, and the divine energy, or the divine essence, or divine nature, simply because the essence as such, because radically and transcendently infinite, is not able to be manifested or participated as such. It requires a manifestation through energies, a manifestation, an operation through powers, namely intellect and will, but those powers manifested and brought to a real energetic term, both ad intra and ad extra, through distinct energies, namely in this instance the energy of understanding or intellect and the understanding of volition. So for Palamas then, the very assertion of the distinction in Christ between nature and nature, and then nature and then wills or powers and energies, entails the kind of distinction he's working with respect to God or theology proper, God ad intra or theology proper. He's saying this same kind of distinction between powers or natures and energies that applies to our analysis of Christ in the economy of salvation must also be true for God in himself. Otherwise, God would not be able to create, manifest himself, nor would we be able to understand anything about God and thereby name God, and thereby in certain ways participate in God and become conformed to God through these distinct energies that God possesses and operates in terms of from all eternity. So in order to kind of recapitulate where we've come so far, we have three basic notions that come to the fore. We have, in the first place, the notion of God's infinity, his essential infinity, in terms of itself. And we also have the aspects of the manifestation of God through his energies, but this manifestation must be in some way finite in terms of the manifestation itself in order for it to be known by a finite created rational agent, and thus be participated either in terms of creation and certain correspondences or proportions or likenesses in the created reality, such as basic aspects of unity, intelligible content, and the like, but also, and more importantly, in terms of participation. If all there was the uncreated, infinitely transcending essence of God, then there ipso facto couldn't be participation in God, because a participation would just simply be identity with God if there weren't a distinction between the infinite essence of God and the uncreated energies of God. So with respect to God, in the first level, then we might say that we speak of God in terms of his infinity as such, of his essence, his super essence, which is basically denoting that there is a maximal perfection of God that is simply superlative. It simply exceeds any external manifestation or participation. Thus, God in his essence is simply imparticipable because his essence is radically infinite, and any infinite being in terms of essence simply is God. So if there's going to be a participation in infinity as such, in this respect, as maximally perfect, that being would be no longer a participation. It would just simply be an identity. It would be simply God himself. So thus, within our consideration of God, we have to then distinguish, according to St. Maximus, the transcendent infinity of God's superessence as something that is formally infinite, intensively infinite, and imparticipable and transcending everything except that formally infinite essence itself. We have to distinguish between that and the discrete energies in terms of their formal content, which is finite, yet in terms of their modal reality, namely, these finite entities are non-subsistent. They don't exist independently of the infinity of God himself, and thus they are, by dint of this non-subsistent modal actuality from eternity in God, they are God in terms of mode and infinity, and thus uncreated. Nevertheless, they're able to be distinguished in terms of discrete energies, namely, for example, the distinction between the eternal logos of Katniss versus Dogness, Peter versus Paul, or the energy of intellection and volition. All of these energies are in some way able to be manifested ad extra by God, and thus in themselves, in terms of their formal content, namely, intellect is not quantitatively, formally infinite. Nevertheless, infinite can subsist non-separably in an identity through its modally infinite perfection in the divinity itself. So thus, the energies themselves take on a modal infinity that designates them as divine, yet nevertheless, as energies, they are not intrinsically descriptive of infinity as such. Thus, you can say there is divine will that simply isn't divine knowledge. And this is important when you come to the question of creation, because if we speak of the perfection of divine knowledge, well, God knows all true. He knows all knowable items by necessity. That's just simply a condition of God's perfect infinite knowledge. But if his intellect was simply identical with his will in terms of any lack of distinction between intellect and will, well, then the will would take on the same characteristics of intellect, and thus the will would also be necessary, and by that necessity would thereby be unfree, and thus unfree to create. Thus, if there's anything outside of God, or anything that's not God, it's not through creation. It's rather through some sort of necessary emanation. So what we have then is within these energies, we have an affirmation of their modal infinity and their non-separability, their non-subsistent reality in themselves as eternal and uncreated, while the energies in terms of their conceptual content or quitative content, their meaning, their import, are in some sense finite because they're able to be participated. So God can manifest uncreated energies that are modally infinite in themselves to creation and in creation by dint of their non-coextensive content or meaning in terms of essence or quiddity, in terms of what this particular thing or energy we're talking about, their distinction and their limitation. He's able to, through these uncreated energy, to then manifest via creation and recreation and participation. So the important upshot here then is within this distinction of the super essence of God, which is formally or intensively infinite, and the uncreated energies of God, while conceptually or quantitatively finite, nevertheless modally infinite, we can say by dint of their non-separability from each other or from divinity itself, they really are God, and God thus is really in and fully in each particular uncreated energy. But nevertheless, because they're not coextensive as energies with that infinite super essence of God, they can really be participated in according to the mode of the receiver. And thus God's uncreated energy, God can act through his uncreated energies directly in creation because the uncreated energies don't denote the same formal infinity of the essence itself. Nevertheless, by dint of their metaphysical unity and identity with the essence itself as divine, as non-composed, they still are God himself. So the distinction then between the formally intensively infinite super essence of God and the modally infinite yet conceptually finite or quantitatively finite energies of God, this allows for there to be a kind of relationship, a mediation established. not a mediation that unites extremes, because again, in God, there are no extremes. Everything is in perfect unity. But it's through the conceptual distinctions based upon the metaphysics of manifestation and participation outlined or first recognized or asserted in the distinction in Christ between natural powers and natural energies, that we find an opening to a way for giving an account of God's superlative distinction and perfection in himself, yet his ability to create, his ability to divinize, and the creature's ability to exist as a finite participation, as well as really participate through the process of theosis in divinity itself. So now we've established at least a prima facie case for some form of distinction between God's essence in itself as, or a superessence in itself as formally or intensively infinite, and the uncreated energies. And the question then arises, is this a real distinction, or is it some other kind of distinction? Well, basically, we can answer yes, it's a real distinction insofar as each energy is sufficiently united in itself as distinct from the formally infinite essence of God on the one hand, and is formally or sufficiently united in itself as distinct from other energies. So thus, any given divine energy, such as, again, divine justice, divine volition, divine intellection, divine power, wisdom, all of these uncreated energies by which God manifests himself and by which we abstract and come to affirm concepts and attribute names to God, yes, there is a real distinction. And the real distinction here is something that imposes itself on the mind by the very structure of God himself as manifesting, as creating, and as being participated in creation. And this is an important point, because the notions of real distinction get kind of lost in translation. For scholastics, typically, a real distinction historically implied the notion of independence and separability. Thus, if we're going to follow St. Gregory's language in terms of Latin terminology, especially Thomistic terminology, if you affirmed a real distinction then between the essence and energies of God, that would thereby imply to the Thomist mind that the essence and energies are able to be separated and are able to exist independently of one another. But of course, St. Gregory does not affirm that kind of real distinction. What he's affirming is that there's a distinction that's objective based upon the nature of the case, the nature of the divine being itself, that imposes itself on the mind. It's not something the mind makes up. And this brings us to the other extreme. If real distinction for many scholastics implies separability and independence, thus seemingly God's essence can exist independently of his energies, which of course, according to St. Maximus and according to Constantinople III, any essence must manifest, and for it to be real as such in terms of energies, then that would simply say God is a composed being, God is an imperfect being. But Gregory is not making that kind of point when he's saying it's a real distinction between essence and energies, nor is he making the point that the distinction we recognize between God's essence and energies, or between the energies themselves, is simply a distinction that our mind comes up with in order to help us better understand something. And in this sense, this is called a distinction of reason, or a virtual distinction, something that the mind brings to an entity that is objectively simple in order and creates for it or imposes upon it pseudo parts or quasi parts in order to better understand what the reality under consideration is. But the key point here is that the mind in a virtual distinction, or a distinction of reason, imposes the difference upon the reality under consideration. It doesn't receive the difference or come to know the difference based upon or from the reality itself. So this brings us to our next point. Is it a real distinction? Well, no, insofar as distinction implies separation from or independence from the essence or eternal energies. If you were to remove any eternal energy from either the essence or from the other eternal energies, God would cease to exist, which is simply impossible by the nature of God's maximal perfection. God is a maximally perfect being, and maximally perfect beings simply cannot be diminished through any kind of loss of either eternal energies from essence or some eternal energy from whatever that infinite collection of eternal energies really is. And of course, these cannot be enumerated. We only know what energies are eternal through an analysis of what God has actually manifested of himself in creation and in revelation. So then the question then, if they're a real distinction, well, how are they then distinguished? They're not distinguished as separable or independent from either each other or from the divine essence, but nor is this real distinction something that the mind just makes up. And so Gregory will answer, as really distinct, the energy's intrinsic integrity and distinctness among themselves and from the super essence of God allows for manifestation and participation to and by creatures. But the distinction itself is prior to the mind's operation. The mind receives and recognizes their difference. This distinction is made by reason alone. Thus, you won't have a turnip, which doesn't have the power of any kind of rationality or cognition, recognizing this kind of distinction. It's only able to be distinguished by a rational being, but that rational being doesn't invent the distinction. It receives or recognizes and affirms the distinction from the reality itself, or on the basis of the reality's manifestation of itself. It doesn't come up with this distinction. Nor will you have an animate being, such as a dog or a cat, recognizing this distinction, because the distinction is one that is only recognizable by a rational agency, an agency that is able to, through abstraction, recognize the irreducible difference between, say, intellection and volition, yet nevertheless recognize that in a perfect being, intellection and volition are inseparable from each other, because you can't have one without the other, nor are they separable or independent from the divine essence as such. Rather, they're ways in which God can manifest himself to finite minds, and ways in which or through which God can create a finite order and not have it simply collapse into a kind of pantheism. So getting back then to this distinction according to reason, I've already stated that initially the term, although it's repeated by many of the fathers, and even taken up probably in Constantinople II by Justinian, but certainly in Constantinople III, as well as by Pope Agatho in his letter to the emperor leading into Constantinople III, it's not really helpful, because it can lend itself to understandings that fall into a kind of materialism, a kind of separation and opposition, or at the other extreme, an understanding that the distinction is something just simply invented by the mind because of its own limitation. No, there's something less than a distinction that implies separation or independence of the energies from the essence or between the energies themselves, but it's something much more than simply something the mind invents or creates and then applies back to its consideration of the divine being as ad intra. And St. Gregory Palamas, really the source of this distinction, and the distinction that he takes on himself in trying to articulate how we're to understand the real difference between God's infinite and super transcendent essence and his uncreated energies that allow for manifestation and participation in creation, is rooted in Methodius of Olympus. And Methodius basically devised a threefold distinction. The first one was simply a separation according to opinion, or according to thought alone. And this distinction basically falls under the categories of form from matter that can subsist separately, such as a key example is the soul and the flesh, or the eidos and the sarx. And in this kind of analysis, which is more materialistic, we find that there's a separation that implies the possibility of distinct subsistence, meaning that form and matter can subsist independently from one another. Also, we can analyze it in terms of the separation of matter from certain qualities. And in this instance, then, matter can subsist, and qualities which are naturally dependent upon matter can also potentially hypostatize or become independent and separate existences from that matter, in a manner, again, that's a hypostatic distinction. Both of these first two modes, the form and matter, or the quality from matter, or matter from quality, examples speak to hypostatic distinctions. And these don't work because when applied to the Godhead and intra, we cannot have simply hypostatic oppositions that result in different or independent separable realities. God is one reality. He's absolutely simple and uncompounded, according to St. Gregory Palamas. Nor, though, does it work with a distinction that is merely mental. And so the distinction, according to opinion, if it affirms true hypostatic separability and distinction, that proves too much. Or if it only affirms a merely mental distinction, that affirms too little, because there's nothing real behind the distinction. A second type of distinction, then, is a separation from some energy or activity according to hypostasis, but merely according to, again, opinion. And the example that St. Methodius uses here is the distinction in a, let's say, a canvas bag full of seed, and we have two kinds of seed. We have wheat seed and barley seed. Well, clearly, in this bag, there is minimally the possibility to distinguish between wheat and barley seeds according to intellect. We can know that barley seeds and wheat seeds are distinct. Going on beyond this, however, we can dump the bag out, or we can start pulling seeds out of the bag, and we can separate into distinct piles wheat seeds and barley seeds. Thus, this kind of mixture, again, is a hypostatic, or results in a kind of through distinction according to reason, a hypostatic distinction, namely the independent subsistence of wheat and barley, and wheat seeds and barley seeds. And again, these can be separated according to hypostasis. And again, is like the first example, kind of rooted more in a materialistic account. Gregory rejects both of these understandings of distinction according to reason, and takes a different example from St. Methodius. And he says this is a distinction from some energy. But this distinction is not according to hypostasis, or according merely to reason alone. Rather, it's an energetic distinction. And Methodius provides an example of a bronze statue. Now, perhaps the example isn't best or most illuminating, but I think you'll see the point Methodius is trying to make here. In the example of a bronze statue, we have both the shape of the statue and the bronze being inextricably linked, such that if you remove the statue form from the bronze is no longer a statue, no longer a bronze statue. On the other hand, if you remove the bronze from the statue is no longer able to subsist or exist as a bronze statue. You need both, and both are inseparable according to reality. Neither is able to subsist hypostatically apart from the other. If you separate the statueness from the bronze statue, it will just be a lump of bronze, or a block of bronze. If you separate the bronze from the statueness, it will simply no longer have, it will no longer be a statue as such. So if you separate or pull out either component of this whole, then you simply have neither. You're left with a loss of statue or a loss of any kind of substantiality to the form statue. And so in this instance, there is a form and matter analogy, bronze being the matter and the form of statue functioning, or the shape of statue functioning as the form, giving it intelligibility. But the statue as such cannot retain traits of either in terms of this composite reality, this composite notion, bronze statue, if the form and the matter, that namely the statue shape and the material bronze, are separated. Nor can bronze statueness entail a kind of independent subsistence without both components. So thus we have in this kind of example that Methodius gives, the reality of non-subsistent partial or quasi-forms that come together in such a way that their separation would entail the destroying of the whole and the non-existent of either in terms of their disposition or actuality with respect to the pre-existing whole. And this is the kind of distinction that St. Gregory, takes up, is this distinction within a unified entity with distinct parts, because it's apparent that bronzeness and statueness are irreducibly distinct nevertheless, and thus the bronzeness is operating energetically, the nature of bronzeness is operating energetically in and through its composition with the shape of the statue. And the statue, the form of statue, also has a certain nature which is energetically manifesting itself through its union with the bronze. There is clearly a real distinction in this sense between the energies of bronze and the energy of statueness. Nevertheless, neither can subsist on its own as a bronze statue, separated. Thus, these two independent entities should not be seen, or these two distinct entities within the context of a bronze statue should not be conceived of as really separable, but rather as two quasi-forms or partial forms coming together to form a composite whole. Now, of course, this breaks down because it is the case that if the form of statueness is taken from the bronze can still subsist as bronze independently. But I think the point that St. Methodius here is getting at is that there are certain kinds of energies within a given being that, if they're separated, destroy the energetic operation of both. And St. Gregory will use better examples, such as examples from geometry. Say the example of a triangle. A triangle has three sides, three enclosed sides with three angles. And in this instance, then, you have different energies manifesting within the one triangle. The lines themselves, the angles, and their unity as a closed geometric figure. And if you removed, say, one side of a triangle, well, then that side itself would no longer subsist as a triangular side, nor would the triangle itself exist. Nevertheless, there are different energies, according to this example, or natures, the nature of a side, the nature of an angle, the nature of closeness, that all are distinct from one another within the reality of a triangle. Nevertheless, in terms of their triangularity, none of these elements can be separated or subsist independently without destroying the reality as such. And through this kind of example, then, Gregory will argue that though there is a real distinction, just like a distinction between, say, the lines of a triangle and the angles of a triangle, there is a real distinction between these. Nevertheless, this real distinction, manifesting the difference between angles and lines, doesn't imply that as for the triangle, the angles and the lines or the sides are not able to be separated from the whole as such. So also in God, the energies, though distinct and though manifesting, are not able to be separated from one another or from the divine essence as such. So in this sense then, St. Gregory will opt for an energetic distinction, or a distinction according to energies, not a kind of distinction that results or affirms in distinct subsistent hypostases. Nevertheless, while affirming that the distinctions are according to energies, this distinction as such is recognizable only through rationality, and thus this distinction is known through reason, but it's not caused by reason, or at least by created reason as such. And it doesn't entail hypostatic separability or independence. So we find then St. Gregory opting for a third mode of distinction, St. Methodius' third mode of distinction, wherein we find that the perfection of God as such, by dint of his formally infinite and transcending essence, yet nevertheless his possession of these uncreated energies, which are conceptually finite but modally infinite, we find then that these energies are not separable, and thus are unable to subsist independently from one another, or independently from the divine being, by dint of the perfect infinity and unity of God himself. Rather, these abstract ideas that we have of God, through which he manifests in creation, are not formally infinite because they're conceivable. And through these energies, or by dint of these energies, we discover two and more objective realities which correspond to concepts in the mind, namely the uncreated energies, the uncreated energy of divine volition versus divine wisdom. These numbers, these energies can be multiplied to the extent that we're able to come up with abstract concepts from created realities which are participating in and manifesting in God's uncreated energies. But the point here is that these energies as such, nevertheless, are inseparable from each other as really and independently existing, nor are they separable, or they're rather inseparable from the infinite essence of God itself. Thus, these abstract ideas, though not formally infinite because conceivable, nevertheless derive from a fully unified being. And here we find St. Gregory using a favorite analogy of later Franciscans, but also St. Augustine, the example of the spiritual soul. In this instance, then, the soul is analogous to God because the soul has three basic powers: memory, intellect, and will. And if you were to separate, or presume that memory could be separated from intellect, or volition from intellect, or vice versa, any other kind of separation you can imagine, you would have none of the above, because will, for example, presupposes and requires intellection, because one cannot will something one doesn't know. By the same token, memory presupposes or demands some sort of objectification or internal speaking of a word, which terminates in understanding, memory being the source of the activity of the soul, and intellect being the term of understanding, and volition being the term of the soul's act coming from memory, terminating in affect or love or disposition. Similarly, God himself is like the soul, whereas the soul has certain energies or quasi-parts that are irreducible to one another. Memory simply isn't will, and memory isn't simply intellect, and so on and so forth. So also in God, an uncreated energy simply isn't the essence, or the essence simply isn't reducible to any uncreated energy. Nevertheless, the essence could not exist or subsist without the energies, nor could the energies subsist or exist apart from the essence. So if you took out the power of, in the human soul, the power of volition, well, it would no longer be a human soul. So also if you took out the uncreated energy of divine eternal volition, it would no longer be God. You would no longer have the infinite perfect essence of God. So what we find then is that these abstract ideas that we have by which we name God derive from a fully unified being that is in an uncompounded infinity, namely, ultimately, the divine essence as such, the divine superessence that is formally and intensively infinite. Nevertheless, though, it's from these and through these uncreated energies that we then formulate abstract concepts that we can understand and by which we understand that we participate and in which we participate itself, we can find that there are ad intra distinctions in God that can be conceptualized via abstraction. And some of these concepts can be limited both in form and in mode. So there's a more distinct or remote kind of participation when God creates a cat, because the very concept of cat implies both formal and modal finitude. Namely, a cat cannot subsist infinitely. Nevertheless, the idea of catness can exist in an infinite mode by virtue of that uncreated energy, namely the divine idea of catness, its subsistence in the infinite essence of God himself by dint of a real uncompounded unity. Other essences or energies can be conceptualized via abstraction from creatures that don't admit any limitation in mode, even if limited in form. And such concepts are understanding or loving or the concept of wisdom or justice. Certainly, we have a concept of each of these realities that we abstract from created personal realities. But nevertheless, when we analyze any of these realities in terms of their ultimate perfection, and thus by implication in terms of their ultimate ground or cause, we then recognize that these modes don't intrinsically have any kind of limitation to finite beings. So thus, if we understand finite love, there's nothing in the concept of love that implies essentially finitude. Thus, it can exist and subsist in an infinite mode in an infinite perfectly being. And all of these then uncreated energies can subsist and coexist as inseparable by virtue of their real and true compossibility in God himself as absolutely infinite, and thus as possessing an infinite number of uncreated energies. So here we then get back to this issue of then God in his super transcendent essence that is unknowable and imparticipable. Nevertheless, this super transcendent essence has natural energies, apart from which that super transcendent essence would not exist. And it's through some of these uncreated energies that he manifests in reality in terms of created items of knowing, and even in revealed items of knowing, as well as creaturely participation in the process of theosis. These energies then can manifest themselves as extra, as inherently uncreate, meaning unlimited, perfect, or they can manifest themselves as create, finite. For example, God can manifest himself as personal and thus having natural powers of intellection and volition in and through created entities, namely created persons who have intellection and volition. And once those notions of intellection and volition are analyzed, we find then that there is no intrinsic limitation to those realities that bars them from being also uncreated realities or uncreated energies subsisting in God himself by virtue of the transcendent essence of God. Whereas we can understand other concepts, created concepts, such as the concept of a body, as inherently limited and inherently finite, nevertheless participating in a more remote way through God's creative powers and through his creating through the uncreated ideas or the uncreated energetic logoi, those logoi that do not admit with respect to God in himself of any kind of modal limitation. Nevertheless, if they're brought to term in reality ad extra, they will have intrinsic limitations with respect to finitude and contingency and the like. And here we can find certain resonances then in St. Gregory Palamas' thought with some metaphysical speculation and developments in the Latin West in the person of Duns Scotus. In the first place, St. Gregory Palamas, along with the majority of the Greek fathers, especially Gregory of Nyssa, as well as St. Maximus the Confessor, emphasize that the notion of infinity is inherently positive. It's both formal and modal. Formal meaning it's intensive and intrinsic in terms of a maximal grade of perfection. Modal designates the manner of existence a given entity, a given energy has with respect to its real subsistence in the divinity itself. Nevertheless, there is a distinction between the modal infinity of the uncreated energies and the formal infinity of the infinite essence of God. In a similar way, then, Scotus will also make this kind of distinction, naming it with respect to God in himself as his essence being formally and intensively infinite, namely maximally perfect, unsurpassable, and ultimately incomprehensible by any creative mind. And then he will also affirm then within God there is the reality of a certain extensive infinity, namely the energies themselves, and also the notion of the ideas, the divine ideas. God necessarily has knowledge of all possibles, and this exceeds what can be creative. So God's knowledge of possible extends to an infinite number of ideas or possibilities that nevertheless cannot be realized extensively, because that would entail a contradiction in terms in the finite order, because by definition, if an actual infinity of possibilities were realized, well then you would have an infinity of a finite created order, which again is a contradiction in terms. And Scotus then navigates how we're to understand and speak about God through his doctrine of the transcendentals. Now, transcendentals here, again, are simply those categories that transcend any kind of limitation through Aristotelian categories, the category of a substance, and then quantity, quality, relation, place, time, and so on and so forth. All of these categories that Aristotle comes up with in terms of substance, and then the 9 accidents, imply finitude, the accidents inhere in a finite substance, and thereby perfect that substance in terms of real existence. These accidents are energies or powers that inhere and depend upon a substance for that substance to exist and to reach its own perfection. And the important point here is, though, the very notion of substance and accidents in terms of the categories implies finitude. The transcendentals then refer to those structures or conditions of being that are not captured within and are not exhausted by these finite categories of Aristotle. And these transcendentals can be coextensive with being, they can be disjunctive, or they can be unique. And in this instance, importantly, they can be unique to the divine being. So coextensive transcendentals which would include those transcendentals that are applicable univocally to every grade and every instance of a category. So thus we can affirm being, unity, and truth to every category. Every substance has being, unity, truth, and goodness, and every accident has a certain being, unity, truth, and goodness, even if the reality is finite and composed within the created order. But the point here is that there are, if there is a reality, this reality is going to have unity, truth, and goodness as derivations of the very notion of being itself. And this brings us to the second point, the notion of the disjunctive transcendentals. And this comes from the East, especially in the figures of Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus the Confessor, and is employed in terms especially of the created disjunct by St. Gregory Palamas himself. And these disjunctive transcendentals then allow us to understand that the coextensive transcendentals, which apply to every reality, can be realized in either a finite or infinite mode, either a created mode or an uncreated mode, either a contingent mode or a necessary mode. All of these realizations. So it's through the transcendentals then that we understand that these transcendentals can be realized in one of two modes, divine or created. And thus this allows us to then make a distinction then between the transcendental as such in terms of its quitative or conceptual content and the intrinsic mode, namely infinite or finite, that this particular object or item under consideration is being understood to exist in or to subsist in. And then finally, we have the notion of unique transcendentals. And some of those transcendentals here, again, simply transcending the categories, but as unique to a divine being, an infinitely perfect being. And some of these unique transcendentals that are applicable only to God in himself would be omniscience, omnipotence, perfect justice, absolute perfection, infinity itself. And so we find then through the doctrine of the transcendentals, we're able to understand better how infinity in God can be manifest ad extra through these various formal and modal distinctions. Formal being what kind of perfection is under consideration in God, in essence, formally infinite and radically transcended, and then through these distinct notions or concepts that we understand through transcendentals, either the coextensive, the disjunctive, or the unique transcendentals, we can then say something about the intrinsic mode, that is, the intensity or grade of perfection in which each of these transcendental perfections exist. And this brings us to a notion in Scotus that corresponds in a certain ulterior way to St. Gregory Palamas. And this is his notion of what are called perfectiones simpliciter simplices, or simply simple perfections, those perfections which are irreducible to other perfections. An example would be, a couple of examples would be the power of intellection and the power of volition. These are pure perfections wherein intellection and volition are simply irreducible in terms of their objective formal content to one another, yet they don't have any intrinsic implication of limitation. Thus, we come to understand intellection and volition, again, for example, in and through our engagement in an abstraction with finite reality, namely finite instances or energies of intellection and volition. Nevertheless, upon analysis of these perfections, we find that there can be nothing simpler. Intellection or volition is not derived from some pre-existing parts or components which come together to form intellection, nor do these pure perfections have any inherent limitations in terms of their formal content. Their formal content in technical terms is indifferent to an instantiation along the or across the disjunction between infinite and finite. Thus, we have from abstraction a knowledge of finite volition, finite love. Nevertheless, when we analyze love, we find that it isn't restricted to the finite side of the disjunction, and in fact depends for its own reality on the infinite, the prior infinite reality of the disjunct, namely in God himself. So thus, these objective pure perfections, such as intellect and volition, imply no inherent limitations. Thus, there's no reason why we should think that intellection as such, or volition or love as such, or wisdom as such should be inherently finite. Rather, by dint of the very finitude of each of these realities that we come to know and then we come to abstract from, we understand their inherent dependence and, in a sense, crying out for an infinite and divine cause and full reality, which explains the beginning of our created rationality and the very cause of our created rationality, and thus our participation in rationality that is ultimately uncreated in a finite created mode, a finite mode with respect to God's infinite mode. So thus we find then through this doctrine of the pure perfections, we're able to use the disjunctive transcendentals in order to understand that various perfections that we find are really manifestations of uncreated perfections or uncreated energetic activities of God that are open to infinity, yet nevertheless knowable by the finite mind and participiable by finite realities, finite creatures, and thus these perfections, considered essentially in terms of their intelligible content and meaning, are finite, but nevertheless, because of their dependence of God on God as uncreate and as cause and as perfectly and eternally energetically operating through these perfections, we find that in God then these same perfections, though formally finite, modally finite in us, are modally infinite in God by dint of God's absolute formal infinity. So thus we find in Scotus, when he's talking about the distinction of the energies in God, he speaks in terms of qualities or perfections in God. But these perfections in God are distinct according to what he calls a formal distinction. And this is getting close to what St. Gregory Palamas is speaking of when he uses St. Methodius of Olympus' notion of energetic distinction. So formal distinction in a scholastic sense doesn't entail real as separable or independent, nor does it entail something that the mind applies just so it can get a better perspective on the reality. For Scotus, the formal distinction is a real distinction, but it's a real distinction insofar as it's recognizable only by reason. But it's recognizable precisely because the distinction, say, between God's uncreated energy of intellection and uncreated energy of volition or love imposes itself through the very reality of God's manifestation of the uncreated energies in creation. And so the formal distinction is real insofar as it's prior to the mind's operation and is not created by the mind, but it's not real insofar as it would entail real separability in God between essence and energies, or essence and perfections, or perfection and perfection. And Scotus lays out 4 basic conditions of the formal distinction, which help us understand what St. Gregory himself is getting at, and what St. Gregory's later disciple, St. Gennadius of Scalarius, the first patriarch of Constantinople after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, is getting at through his appropriation of Franciscan metaphysics in order to explain and apply and defend the Palamite real distinction between essence and energies in God. And the 4 conditions that Scotus lays out are quite simple really to understand. Is the first condition is one, that the items under consideration or the items known are in act or are energetically processing and manifesting even in God prior to the mind's operation. The second condition is that the items have formal or quitative being, meaning they have meaningful content that is distinct and independent, or rather irreducible to the other perfections or energies in a way that is not merely virtual. And by merely virtual, I mean here is something, again, reason brings to bear in order to distinguish it. No, the distinction is objective because of the quitative being or reality of the items under consideration. The distinction between, say, the uncreated energy of God's intellection versus his uncreated energy of volition. The third condition is that the items are actually distinct and not confused. And actually here means is that they exist by virtue of themselves and are distinct by virtue of their own integrity and distinctness. They're not simply confused items that the mind then separates. It's not like the bag of wheat seeds and barley seeds. No, these are distinct by virtue of themselves, and they're not mixed, they're not confused. And then the fourth is that the items have real identity in being or essence. And here, Scotus is simply designating, again, that the items are compossible with one another and are really, in terms of metaphysics, in terms of being or reality, identical. And that being or reality as identical with respect to the divine essence is simply the reality of God's uncompoundedness, his absolute maximal perfection. So with these four distinctions then, or these four conditions of the formal distinction, we find a great similarity between Latin scholastic metaphysics in the Franciscan mode and Paulamite metaphysics in the Byzantine mode, both, however, stemming from that primordial insight that comes out of St. Maximus Lateran 649 and Constantinople 3 of that distinction between essence and energies in any reality. If there's a nature, that nature must manifest or operate through energies. But these energies are not simply reducible to the essence as such. They're not coextensive with the essence because they name distinctly, whereas in a formally infinite being cannot be named distinctly because a distinct name is a derivation of a distinct concept, and a distinct concept admits of limitation and abstraction from finite entities. Of course, God is not finite, he's infinite. So some final thoughts then is, in reality, Latin Franciscan theology and Greek Paulamite theology on the essence energies question are closer than many on both sides would want to admit, especially many of the hardcore Eastern Orthodox, especially 20th century neo-patristic Orthodox scholars. And also on the Latin side, they're closer than many Thomists would want to admit, because again, Thomists do not admit of any real distinction between essence and energy, nor do they admit of the same functional reality in and through the formal distinction. They rather uphold that any kind of distinction we predicate of God ad intra or in se is, save for the distinction between persons, which they affirm are real or is real, is something that is applied by reason. Rather, any kind of distinction for a Thomist in God with respect to his essence and his perfections, his essence and his properties or energies, is something that is merely a distinction of reason that is post factum, or even in a manner ad hoc, brought to bear upon our consideration of the divine being or essence as such in order for us to have better understanding. Palamas and Scotus and the Franciscans go against this notion and say no, that there's an objective distinction between the essence and the energies and between the various energies. And this is rooted then in both the Franciscan schools as well as the Paulamite schools' understanding of infinity, which is almost an entirely Greek patristic notion, and a clear departure from and development of pagan notions of infinity, which essentially implied imperfection. No, for the Franciscans and for Palamas, infinity is a positive notion that designates the divine being as Saint Anselm of Canterbury would say, that than which nothing greater is able to be or to be conceived. And only God knows it. Only God himself understands God himself in this manner, in this infinite degree or infinite perfection. Both the Franciscans and the Scotists, the Franciscans and the Palamites, have a shared notion of the objective, real, or formal distinction between essence and energies energies and energies. They affirm in common the formal or conceptual limitedness of the energies, while affirming the modal infinity of the same energies. And this allows for a notion of creation and recreation on the part of God in terms of his initiative, as well as a notion of knowledge and naming of God and participation in God in and through these formally limited energies, yet modally infinite energies by dint of their real identity or the sameness of being in the one God. There are some differences, however. I'm not certain to what degree the differences are substantive, but they're clear terminological differences. For Scotus and the Franciscans, he affirms the blessed vision in heaven is an intuitive vision and direct, not mediated through abstract concepts, but nevertheless the created intellect sees the divine essence as a whole. However, there's an important caveat coming right out of Augustine and repeated by figures like Anselm and especially St. Bonaventure, that even though the essence is perceived as a whole, the essence is not perceived wholly or comprehensively. Thus, there is maintained this notion of the radical transcendence of God in himself as formally infinite and thus imparticiple qua infinite and incomprehensible qua infinite. For Palamas, he would say that the essence of God is never seen in itself, but we only see the divine energies. In this sense, I wonder if the Franciscans and the Palamites are closer than their formulations might allow, because the Franciscans and the Latins as a whole, on the one hand, including St. Thomas, deny that the divine essence as such is ever comprehended. And Palamas says, because the divine essence can never be comprehended, it's never seen. I think they have different semantics in terms of seeing and understanding here, but both are in common affirming that the divine essence as such is never participated or comprehended, and that this kind of perfect experience of beatitude is something that is ultimately not gained through the process of abstraction. And nevertheless, both affirm that distinct perfections that are formally limited, even if modally infinite, can be seen in this life and the next. And to sum this up then, with their common doctrine of infinity, this disallows seeing for Palamas, but for Bonaventure and Scotus, this disallows comprehension. And I wonder again if the metaphysics is closer here, and it would seem prima facie to be closer based upon their common understandings of infinity and the application of the objective, real, or formal distinction between essence and energies and energies. And it may be the desire to maintain canonical language respective to both the Byzantine tradition on the one hand and the Latin tradition on the other. That's something that can be further discussed, but I think the metaphysical structures we find are quite compatible and are converging to the point of virtual identity on the fundamental points that both and fundamental truths and realities that the Palamites, St. Gregory himself, and on the one hand, and the Franciscans, especially St. Bonaventure and Blessed John Duns Scotus on the other hand, are trying to articulate and preserve and defend.